Operations of war have come to imply dedication to the total destruction of the enemy. It would increase the danger of misunderstanding our true objectives. The August 2nd, 1961 issue of the Congressional Record contains a statement by Senator J.W. Fulbright, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and, of course, a longtime exponent of the grand design. Here is what Fulbright said. In the long run, it is quite possible that the principal problem of leadership will be to restrain the desire of the people of America to hit the communists with everything we've got, particularly if there are more Cubas. Well, returning to the State Department, we find that by 1962, the man who was then running the Foreign Policy Planning Division was Walt Rostow, President Kennedy's special advisor on foreign affairs. In a report to the President entitled Basic National Security, Rostow stated, "Rising tensions or pleas of the American public must be ignored in any crisis with Russia. The temptation must be avoided to degrade or embarrass the Soviets in the eyes of the world." If you've been wondering why it is that we can't seem to win any wars against the communists, it's simply because it's our policy not even to embarrass them, much less to defeat them. In 1963, the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency financed a report by the Peace Research Institute, published in April of that year. And here is what our tax dollars produced. Whether we admit it to ourselves or not, we benefit enormously from the capability of the Soviet police system to keep law and order over the 200 million Russians and the many additional millions in the satellite states. The breakup of the Russian Communist Empire today would doubtless be conducive to freedom, but would be a good deal more catastrophic for world order. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, according to the grand design, supposedly, it's in our own self-interest for the Soviet police state to remain intact, to remain stable, and to maintain its death grip over the captive nations. Well, that kind of reasoning leads us next to the pages of one of the most influential newspapers in the world, the New York Times. On August 16, 1961, the Times ran this editorial: "We must seek to discourage anti-communist revolts in order to avert bloodshed and war. We must, under our principles, live with evil, even if by so doing we help to stabilize tottering communist regimes, and perhaps even expose citadels of freedom to slow death by strangulation." Is that shocking? Well, if you accept the premise of the grand design, it shouldn't be. It's then merely the cold and objective appraisal of our limited alternatives in this nuclear age. Well, let's bring this philosophy now to its ultimate conclusion and see what the world planners have to say about the future role of American sovereignty. Returning again to the words of Senator Fulbright, we find this most revealing book by him entitled Old Myths and New Realities. And bear in mind that this was written by the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, one of the most influential legislative committees in Washington. Now, on page 25, Senator Fulbright has this to say: "The problem for American policy is not in defining what we would like. It is rather how to live with the best we can get." And then on page 87, he continues, "The concept of national sovereignty has become in our time a principle of international anarchy. Our survival in this century may well turn out to depend upon whether we succeed in transferring at least some small part of our feelings of loyalty and responsibility from the sovereign nation to some larger political community." And then again he repeats back here on page 108, just so that no one misunderstands what he's trying to say. "The sovereign nation can no longer serve as the ultimate unit of personal loyalty and responsibility." Well, I think it's pretty obvious that many of our leaders in Washington long ago have transferred substantial portions of their personal loyalty and responsibility from the sovereign nation of the United States to the larger political community called the United Nations. In their own minds, it's likely that they consider themselves to be citizens of the world first and citizens of the United States second. In any decision where the interests of America are in direct conflict with those of the larger political community, you can be sure that America will wind up on the short end. Our former Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, in a lecture at Ohio Wesleyan University entitled Toward World Unity, phrased it this way: "What I initially propose involves an organization dedicated to the general welfare, the peace and order of mankind, and the assuming of an allegiance to this goal superior to that of any national allegiance." Well, returning again to the words of Walt Rostow, our former chief of the State Department Policy Planning Division, we find an unusually open and frank summary of the objectives of the grand design spelled out in his book, The United States in the World Arena, which incidentally was subsidized by the CIA. Way back here on page 549, Rostow says, "It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests. Since this residual right is the root of national sovereignty, it is therefore an American interest to see an end to nationhood, as it has been historically defined." Well, Justice of the Supreme Court William Douglas wrote an essay entitled The Rule of Law in World Affairs, published in 1961 by the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, which in turn, of course, is financed by another of those tax-exempt foundations, the Fund for the Republic. On page 32, Douglas wrote, "There is no reason for us to get tangled up in legalisms that march inexorably to the conclusion that total and complete sovereignty must be retained. For we now know that when that claim is pressed by all nations, everyone faces extinction in a nuclear holocaust." Well, that's a pretty precise summary of the grand design. In just 2 sentences, we're told that it's either world government or the bomb. Take your choice. By the way, the general theme and purpose of that pamphlet was to generate public support for increasing the power and prestige of the UN World Court, and also to lend support to a drive at that time for the repeal of the Connolly Amendment. Now, without getting too involved in this, I should explain that when the Senate ratified the UN statute of the International Court of Justice and agreed to commit the United States to accept the final decisions of the UN World Court, it was generally understood that the court would never meddle into our purely domestic affairs. But there were some who feared that in time the World Supreme Court would begin to find legalistic ways to declare that what we think is strictly our own business and no one else's is, in a larger sense, also the concern of mankind. So, to prevent the World Supreme Court from extending its jurisdiction into our local affairs, the same way in which the Federal Supreme Court has gradually assumed jurisdiction over what was once considered to be the local affairs of our own states, the Senate voted for an amendment to the statute proposed by Senator Tom Connolly. This amendment still stands and simply says that what is or is not a domestic affair of the United States will be determined by the United States, not by other nations or by the World Court itself. And so it's understandable why the grand designers have felt the need to generate greater public support for the International World Court and to repeal the Connolly Amendment. Now, on April 4th, 1960, Vice President Richard Nixon issued a statement under the official seal and letterhead of his office. And this statement read in part as follows: "Many well-intentioned people have raised the basic question, why have an international court in the first place? The answer